Hey, it's Drybear. Jonathan Rogers, one of the directors for Path of Exile 2, just did another interview going over the state of Dawn of the Hunt Season 2 for Path of Exile 2. So we're going to recap what went on in the interview, everything that was said, and kind of color in my own perspective on things as we go along. Now, if you've been living under a rock, the second season, or the first major update for Path of Exile 2 went live last week, or just over a week ago. And it started out as mostly negative, especially on PC. However, it has been trending towards mixed recently. It moved up a couple percentage points above the threshold of mostly negative to focus on that. And there was a big interview early last week that had some people up in a tiffy. As people entered into Season 2, a lot of people noticed that the campaign felt slower and longer, that people were in some cases pushing 25, 30, 35 hours just to complete the campaign. People were saying that they felt weak, that they just weren't as strong as they were in Season 1, and just had major complaints about the feel of Season 2, just kind of sitting into that slog category. The word of slog or slow or just a long grind comes up a lot in the discussion of PoE 2. However, in an interview last week, Jonathan and Mark, the two directors for Path of Exile 2, gave their feedback on where things were, and that one had some awkward moments because there were some disagreements on what was being felt, how to solve it, and the perspective of things, and that led to a lot of clips and discussions which we already covered. But in this new interview, some of that was touched on again, and there was some more information on where the directors feel the game is going and where it is with Season 2 and what they're going to do moving forward.
Yep, it's been a week for sure. And it's like, I would definitely say we've never had so we've had a few cases that have been close to this, I would say, in the past, in terms of the community being very unhappy about a lot of things. But this one was certainly taking the cake as far as that is concerned. But I mean, at the end of the day, the response is always the same thing, right? Like, we hear what people say, we try things out, we see if we, what we agree with, and then we try to find solutions that are going to fix, any kind of problem that the community have, and we keep on doing that. We keep iterating. I would say one of the things that's been going on this time is there's certainly like an urgency at the moment to feel like, okay, we have to make sure that everything we're doing, we're like telling people that immediately. We certainly wouldn't post like patch notes every day normally. So normally, of course, that stuff's sort of happening in the background. But we really wanted to make sure people are understanding the fact that we are kind of looking into these things and improving things. So that's certainly been a bit of a ride. I'm certainly a believer that the more we do that, the more the people will will effectively be happy once we've made fixes to all of the different things they're unhappy about. The hardest part, honestly, is just identifying the problems.
Which I think is a very good observation. Many cases when you're in early game development, like early access, alpha, closed beta, open beta, because things are changing more aggressively than normally would be expected from a release state, oftentimes that necessitates better communication. And I think that there was a big divide between the communication that the community needed for this kind of change and the communication that they got for multiple reasons. Obviously, the expectations were not lined up with what actually resulted in the changes for Season 2. The biggest one is, it was identified that there were some end game scaling issues with the game. There were some people that were doing, the pinnacle, like the uber boss, the hardest boss in Path of Exile 2 that takes like a week or more for the best players to complete. They were killing him in under a second. There's still builds in Season 2 that 1 or 2 or 3 shot the hardest boss in the game. And so the problem that was identified and talked about going into Season 2 is that they wanted to make sure that they spread out and balance the end game better, so that wasn't the case, that even if you had a perfectly optimized build that's insanely strong, that maybe the fight lasted 10 seconds or 30 seconds, not necessarily was under a second and just being deleted off of your screen. So that was the expectations, right? The community was expecting those kind of changes going into Season 2. However, what ended up happening is all of these nerfs and adjustments ended up trickling down to the campaign progress, which means that not only were where people, the majority of people, were experiencing the campaign for the second or third time. They maybe played it once on average, like large cohorts, but on average played it maybe once or twice in the season 1, went and played other games. They're coming back, they're having to do the same campaign again, and this time it's just slower than it was before and feels like it's dragged out more. And so that definitely was exacerbated. And so from this standpoint, I think there would have been some better communications of like, hey, here are the changes we're making, here's what we're doing, and here's what we're working on and working towards that might help that experience be better received for a lot of the players going into season 2. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that they're just going to keep making changes. They're going to keep focusing on making the game better, that this is just one step along in the journey. There's also just a lot of questions of, is this actually an early access game, considering the size of the player base and how many people are playing, and can they actually continue to make changes like this on a regular basis as they move forward?
And you know, yeah, I'll go in, we'll start working on stuff, and hopefully, you know, like, people will like the changes we're making. I guess that's the main thing, right?
And I think another takeaway from this interview, which I'm actually very glad that Jonathan, I was very pleased with his response here, because there was a discussion, by the way, this is the Drop Frames interview that was shown, we'll link that down below, but there was a question of like, you know, how can you treat this as a game? Like, is this actually an early access? Is this an early version of the game? Do you have to treat it as release? And there were some discussions that really went around, okay, can we make major changes to the game during the season? How do players expect us to make changes during development? And as we go into new seasons, what are the expectations around how the game is going to change and how it's going to feel relative to the season before? And I gotta give credit to Jonathan, like, the question was framed as like, hey, it's early access, why are people expecting things to not be turbulent? But I think that Jonathan actually gave the correct answer, which is, regardless, you have so many players playing the game, you have people that paid to play the game, there are people playing the game a lot. You can't really treat it as just a side project that has a closed alpha, because the game is effectively out. You may be looking at a marketing tentpole later down the line that will be the 1.0 release, because we're on .2 right now, but realistically, you can't treat it as a closed alpha game because it's so, like, picked up and played by so many people. They have so many players playing the game now that they actually do have to treat it as a launch game, which Jonathan correctly identified.
We agreed to buy it in early access, so we should be, I mean, I'm not trying to like kiss your ass or anything, but like,
I actually don't fully know if I even agree that because a player, like, we don't have any right to a player's forgiveness, really. Like, at the end of the day, like, people have the experiences they have, and we just have to live with that. And it's like, I mean, look, if we're going to sell a product, then, you know, people should have the expectation they're going to enjoy the product that they're buying, right? Like, right. You know, like, sure, we call it early access, and that it is, right? Like, that is a label that does something as far as, like, player expectations is concerned, and that is important. But at the end of the day, you still have to deliver a product that people are enjoying. So, yeah, I mean, from that perspective, like, I can't be unhappy when people are, like, I can't use the excuse of, oh, it's just early access when I'm talking to players, because at the end of the day, like, that's not a constructive thing for me to even say. I guess one of the things that being an early access does mean, though, is that, you know, like, there are a lot of people who won't play something that's an early access until we're saying that it's fully finished. And so that's kind of part of what you do get from being an early access, is you get to kind of, you know, like, you get to effectively limit the number of people who are playing until you're sort of ready for that big, you know, for that big surge of players that you'll get for release. Sure. So, you know, and that's the thing. And so it's like, from that perspective, it's a very unusual early access, right? Because we had so many players. Like,
so I think the takeaway there is that they have the right mentality, is they're trying to figure out what they can change. They've already acknowledged that they can't make sweeping nerfs to specific builds that people are playing inside of a specific league, right? When they made changes to the cast on freeze or cast on crit or things like that, the frost meteor, the spark changes and things like that, obviously people are not enjoying those. If they spend 2 weeks working on a character and you just nerf the build mid-season, it makes it very uncomfortable. And they're also learning with this update as well, as they kind of came into .2 thinking they could make a lot of core fundamental changes to the difficulty of the game and the speed of the game and the accessibility of people playing through some of the harder areas of the game. Now, obviously that came with a lot of harsh lessons, and that how they made the adjustments for endgame ended up greatly impacting the early game. And we'll talk a little bit later on how they perceive the situation of campaign skips, whether the campaign being repeated a bunch of times over many years is something they want to have happen, so on and so forth. Now, the next thing that's worth talking about is something that came up a lot in last week's interview and this interview as well, is basically what are they trying to accomplish with the game. And I think something that's coming up quite a bit is just Jonathan and Mark's perspective on how they handle changes. And this is a tough topic to broach because in general, I think most games that just do whatever the player base wants all the time end up failing in the long term, because you lose track of the vision. If developers working on the game aren't excited to work on the game or aren't happy with where it's going and they're just doing whatever the community asked for, that ends up leading to ruin. But there's also a balancing act that goes along with that as well, is that you really need to be paying attention and being linked into the feedback that the players are giving. And kind of take this with a grain of salt, but let's look at something that came up in the interview last week that was heavily reiterated in this interview that I want to bring your attention to, which is how the higher ups in GGG are taking the approach of what they want to do with Path of Exile 2, and then you can share your opinion down below on what you think is right or wrong about this approach.
The key thing really is that I'm never going to make a change unless I can reproduce the suck for myself. Like, I'm not going to just believe someone when they say this is bad. I'm going to say, okay, so you're telling me that's bad, great. I'm going to play this. I'm going to try and get to a situation where I can understand why you're feeling this way. Because if I don't do that and we just make random from the hip changes, then, it's not going to result in a game that I'm happy with. And that's kind of important because, in order to make the game good, it's really important that the people who are at the top level are playing that game every day. I have to be making a game that I'm enjoying. So effectively, I need to be finding the things that are going to make the game more fun for me and the players without making it less fun for me, effectively.
Which is something I go back and forth on in this situation. Like I said, you do want to make sure that the devs are staying actively involved in the development process and they're making a game that they enjoy and can see people enjoying. But I think that there needs to be a little bit of a concession here where the developers need to say, okay, as an individual gamer, it is not possible for me to cover the gambit of subjective experiences that a game can cover, right? There's always going to be situations where you think a class is not fun, but it's not made for you. You aren't the reciprocal, you aren't the receiver of that class experience. And if you always end up making the same experience over and over that's always for you, you're going to drastically reduce the scope and breadth of the audience that you have. So you really need to understand that as an individual person, a subjective conscious being, there's only so much of the experience that you can see. You're going to have tons of blind spots, and there's also going to be things that people that have views on the world, that have views on gameplay, that have views on how they enjoy their games, that are just not going to make any sense to you or will not have any perspectives. And that's why you need to be able to not only include things that, hey, this is fun for me, this is something that I want to do, but also include things that maybe wouldn't be fun for me, but I can see that it's there, that makes things more interesting for someone who doesn't have the same beliefs that I have. And another thing that's super important too is I think that a lot of games struggle with the idea of novelty. There are some cases where developers may not do something because they don't like it or doesn't make sense to them. However, in some cases it helps you break the monotony. Like, there are some class designs, some encounter designs, some build designs, some gameplay experiences that may not be super popular, but the people that get those experiences and enjoy them love them a lot, and it also helps separate the monotony so you don't have 12 human male warrior classes and 35 dark forest thickets that are running through over and over. Having that variety is the spice of life, and making sure that the people that enjoy certain things about the game get to enjoy those. And I think one of the best examples that I can give, and this is something that I kind of preached a lot back when I was a developer, is that you never want an experience to be like a 5 or a 6. You either want an experience on a rating scale of 1 to 10, you want the experience to be either a 1 or a 2 or a 9 or a 10. And what I mean by that is, an experience that's for everyone is an experience that's for no one. You don't want everyone in the world to pick up a class or a skill gem or a build or a unique item or an encounter in a campaign. You don't want everyone in the world to say, it's pretty average. You want people that are going to gravitate towards that unique experience, and the people that like it absolutely love it. They say it's a 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. And the people that aren't for that experience, it's not for them, they can say that they hate it or they don't like it, or it's not really, like, obviously it wasn't made for them. It's like a 1 or a 2, but that's perfectly fine. And it's better than trying to alienate both groups by saying, hey, the people that really like this stuff, we're going to nuke it and cut it so that the people that don't like it might like it more, rather than just saying, let the people that enjoy this subsection of the game to their fullest and let the people that don't play a different area of the game or play a different class or play a different build.
At the end of the day, though, it's like, okay, people, if people aren't like playing in a way that I expect, it's because we haven't communicated the way we want people to play it, or people have tried it and they've not enjoyed it and that kind of stuff, right? So that's, at the end of the day, it's always on us still. But it's, you know, it's just one of those things that well, you learn a lot from playing. And I think it's interesting as well, because when I went into this launch with the Huntress in particular, I was kind of like, look, regardless of any other changes were made, regardless of any content, I was like, I know the Huntress is fun. Like, I've been playing it, I really, really love it. Like, it is my favorite class that we have made.
Oh.
You know, so then that kind of then took me very by surprise when there were a lot of concerns about the Huntress at the start. It really comes down to those sort of playstyle things, right? Where like, you know, with the parries and the and disengage, like the whole like sort of in-out gameplay style, like I was really, really enjoying that. And a lot of our staff are as well, right? Like we've got a lot of people who are like, yeah, man, this is really awesome. Like it's got a sort of feeling of action that we haven't had, you know, like from the other classes to the same extent. There was that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it was really interesting that we had quite a lot of pushback about that. So then it kind of, once again, it came down to, you know, like we need to try the play styles that we're not trying. Like we need to, I need to try doing things that I wouldn't otherwise try, and then find out why, if those things are the problem.
And this is typically something that I would see from developers, at least on working on their first game, is kind of figuring out, obviously when you're working in a pre-development situation, you don't have player feedback. The developers have to be the one driving the direction and the vision of the game. However, a lot of times when you're making something, you know, I think it is very important that developers try to, you know, listen but verify, right? They're trying to understand what the problems are and where they're coming from. But also at a certain point when you get feedback that people say, hey, I don't like this gameplay, I generally tend to move away from the answer that is, okay, well, do you understand how to, are you doing it right, kind of thing? Because I think that a lot of times, especially in games like this, you do want people to be able to have an experience. If you're drawn to the Huntress, for example, and I'm having a great time with my Huntress, I think the Huntress is a ton of fun, but there are people that are saying that it's not great, and I think that the response that is, you know, are you sure you're doing it right, is not really the response that I would expect to have from this, especially moving forward. And I would think that a good direction for them would be to try and make more of those experiences that maybe are counter to what the developers would expect, or maybe is counter to what people already like about the game, just trying to push that envelope. Because again, my philosophy, especially when it comes to game design, is I'd much rather have a polarizing experience than risk boring players. I think if you bore players or piss them off and they leave, that's far worse than trying to make something that might be a little too different or too out there or too risky. Which leads us perfectly into the next topic, which is this idea of target audience. This was brought up a lot in the interview of who are you making the game for? Is it, you know, one of the biggest critiques about Path of Exile 1, the precursor to PoE 2 is, you know, a lot of people played PoE 1 and were turned off by it because it was, you know, one of the more deep system-driven games on the market, a little bit more obtuse and difficult to understand, and also had one of the highest barrier of entries of any game that you can play now. Being a brand new player without previous experience coming into Path of Exile 1 is incredibly difficult. And so they're trying to accomplish with Path of Exile 2 this idea of blending audiences, making PoE 2 more accessible for players that might be getting into either Path of Exile for the first time or an ARPG for the first time, and also being able to appease the players that play 400 hours of Path of Exile 2 every single month, or it's the only game they play and they play tons and tons and tons of hours every single season. How do you make it so that you can make both those groups of players happy, right? Like if you're nerfing the end game builds that are instantly deleting the hardest content in the game, and that makes the end game a little bit more varied. However, it also makes the campaign experience for the other 90% of your player base that isn't doing that and has yet to even face the Arbiter of Ash a single time. How do you balance the design for both those groups, and is that even possible?
Okay, so if you imagine the sort of Venn diagram of this, as it were.
Okay, yeah, Zeke and Ziz, the circles.
Where you've got like the things. So the question you're effectively asking is there any overlap there?
Yeah.
Right? Like, is there a place where the game can be that both of those players are happy with it? And I am a believer that yes, there is. I think there are a lot of players who would say that there isn't, but I still believe that there is. And that is the thing the target we're attempting to hit. Now, the difficulty of that is that we're attempting to hit a smaller target, right? Because if we have to nail the dart right into the intersection of those 2 points, then that is a smaller target to hit, which means our job is more difficult. And I would say that balancing PoE 2 is actually much harder than balancing PoE 1 has been. But I think that a lot of the reasons why Path of Exile 1 had people like you bounce off them is not necessarily the same kind of reasons that people, that PoE 1 players are unhappy with PoE 2 right now. I think that those reasons are just incidental complexity that never actually mattered. Like, I don't think that anyone is like crying out for PoE 2 to use PoE 1's gem socketing system. Like, that is not the criticism that PoE 1 players have. And yet it was like a huge thing that caused PoE 1 to be hard for new players. So it's like there are changes that are just straight up wins for one group that don't affect the other group, and that's the kind of changes we're trying to make. Things are less complicated, like a nicer to play, like those kinds of things. And so like my hope, like I really don't think that the sacrifices, I don't think there's many sacrifices a PoE 1 player should be having to make to play PoE 2, and I really don't think that should even be how the PoE 1 player should look at it. I believe that there really is an intersection there where we can make both groups of those players like happy about the game.
And while this is a lofty goal, I think it is a good one. I think there should always be a focus on every area of your game. However, this is something that, at least having worked on many PvP games that have matchmaking and stuff like that, there was always, working on Paladins or Smite with ranked modes and whatever, you kind of have to pick a target that helps you create a rubric for your decision making around the game balance, right? Like you wouldn't want to say you're on the balance team for League of Legends or Dota 2 or Valorant or whatever. You wouldn't want to balance the game for every rank tier, because I think that is something that ends up making the game worse overall. Generally, at least in my opinion, the correct solution for this question is to find the area of the game that is not the upper echelon, right? You don't want to be, making major changes to the game based on 1% of the player base or even 5% of the player base, right? You don't want to be making changes to the game that really only affect a small portion, but you also don't want to be making changes to the game that solves a problem that is only exist because people haven't spent enough time with the game, right? So you wouldn't want to be making changes that balance the game for people that just loaded up for the first time and threw one basic attack and didn't like it. And I think the correct answer to these kinds of questions is try to find the section of the game that is the most representative of someone who has minimize their mistakes, right? They have some level of knowledge, they've gone through that learning experience, and they've kind of pushed through. And I think this is the correct answer for most games. So you would say anyone that's got to like maybe level 70, they've started doing Atlas, and they're starting to push some of the end game content or maybe progress, kind of look at that as your main staple, because that usually will represent the largest cohort of the game itself. Now, this isn't always the case, but I think it's very important that you don't want to try and, do trickle down balance nomics as you go to the top, because it ends up worsening some other aspects. Regardless of that though, you also still want to make sure that the early game and the onboarding process is very strong. Which leads us into the next topic, which was brought up in the interview, and something that I think hopefully they're able to become more flexible on over time, is just the idea of having feedback based on the player experience and how to act on that feedback. Because obviously the game launched, there was a ton a metric ton of players that played the game, more than any game could ever hope for. And there's still, they range from 140K to 200K CCU on a regular day for Season 2, and that doesn't even include the console players. So there's still, Path of Exile 2, regardless of the feedback, is still one of the biggest games in the world right now, one of the most played games in the world right now. But I think that what was identified in this interview is something that I would have said at the very beginning. There's tons of issues that people had been identifying or been talking about in Season 1 that really weren't addressed or targeted at all going into Season 2. And then the changes they made that focused on some of the later game issues of the game only exacerbated those issues. So things like running into collisions and sliding around, having monsters surround you or push you or block you, having monsters being faster than you, some of the difficulty spikes being kind of weird, the drop rates and the itemization if you're not someone who is exceptional at the game, right? If you've only put in 15, 20, 30, 100 hours into the game and you saying that I'm not getting enough currency items, I'm not getting enough upgrades, I'm not getting enough gear that feels righteous to me, that's a problem. And if you're going to make adjustments to how quickly people can scale up in the end game, you're only going to make that specific problem worse. However, the big win here is that Jonathan actually identified this in the interview. So they're thinking about it and they're putting it on their radar, which bodes well for the continuation of Season 2 as well as the introduction of Season 3 and beyond.
Well, I mean, the issue with that, of course, is that I wasn't paying as much attention to other things that that were problems, right? Which is definitely a concern.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting because I think that one of the issues that we had. Okay, so I'm gonna blame Christmas. So what happens is that so we release early access, right? And then we've got like 3 weeks before everyone's off in their break. And during that 3 weeks, we're in this mode where we're like responding to problems and we're like trying to fix things and everything happens. And then we've got like 3 weeks where where Christmas happens and everyone kind of goes away. We've lost the context of even being in the mode of like, we're responding to what the players are complaining about kind of thing. And it's like, bear in mind as well, at the start of early access, that like, 7 out of 10 people are talking to me are being like, oh wow, the game's amazing, it's so cool. Like, because what they're doing is they're playing through the game for the first time, they're experiencing all the bosses, they're experiencing all, just the graphics and the art, and like everything's cool, right? So they're all like, oh wow, the game's amazing, right? And so you got a bunch of people who are also talking about problems, and those are real problems, right? But they're being drowned out by the positivity of like everyone experiencing this new game for the first time.
Sure.
And so like, nothing that the players are complaining about today is something that people weren't complaining about back then. It's just that they weren't the loudest voices in the room at the time, and now they are.
Which is a huge realization and admission for them, and I'm so glad that they were able to identify this as well, is that, some of the issues that were being brought up consistently in Season 1 going forward were kind of just off the radar, which means that because they were off the radar, not only were they not being made better, because nothing really gets better on its own unless you focus on it, but on top of that, because they weren't being, people weren't paying attention to those issues and they were still making changes to the game, it's very easy when you do that to make those problems worse because you're not keeping them in mind. So the fact that they're aware that some of those core issues existed in Season 1 and they weren't paying attention to them or making them better, which means that if they weren't paying attention to them, they can accidentally make them worse, which is something that we saw a lot with the interview last week. They said, we didn't make any changes to the campaign, we didn't make the campaign longer, we didn't make the early game harder. Why is everyone saying that we did? And obviously it's because they weren't paying enough attention to the campaign and the early game because they were focused so hard on some of the higher end issues at the end game, which, to be fair, I would say that most players don't make it to the hyper end game anyway. They are making it through the campaign, they're getting into the Atlas, they're making some progress into the Atlas, and as you get further into the Atlas, the amount of players that last that long, I would say, is shrinking every single level that you have there. So I think that them being able to recognize that and keep that on their radar is going to make a world of difference for future patches. Next up is a really important topic and something that is a little bit more dev focused. So if you haven't worked on software or done creative development of any kind, it may be a little bit foreign to you, but it's the idea of, what a proper test case looks like for a new character. And this is something that, again, I have a lot of experience with working on character-based games like Smite or Paladins, where you have to make a lot of characters and every character experience matters, it's very important that the people that are working on the class or the mechanic or the experience are actually trying the experience, and more importantly, trying it in the way that the player would experience it, right? There are many times where, I actually, I hate to bring up Warframe, but I had this, experience in Warframe. I've never been a Warframe player, but I tried it out for the first time maybe 2-3 months ago. And one of the things that I noticed about Warframe, at least in my experience, was that the new player experience wasn't very good. And I had some feedback and some kickback from Warframe players that have been playing, since the dawn of Warframe, saying, you don't know what you're talking about, the new player experience is fine. However, a lot of those players have been playing for 7 to 10 years and have not been a new player for nearly a decade, which means they have not done the new player experience. So in their mind, that they're looking at it through a nostalgia rose-tinted glasses, they think it's perfect, but they haven't experienced it recently, so it's hard for them to draw on that kind of experience. I think the same thing here is true, is that if you're not, actually going through the process of making a character, leveling it up, getting the gems, and going through the campaign, it might be easy to say that, hey, the campaign's fine, nothing's wrong with it, what are you talking about? But actually sitting down and putting the time there, I think, is very important.
But there's actually this phenomenon that's like kind of annoying, which is that unless you actually play a class from the beginning, there's something about it that just doesn't quite work in testing. Like you never get the same feeling unless you actually play through on the character. Like if you just make a character and at endgame, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to put all these skills on it, and you sort of feel, you might think that you have the right idea about what the items should be, but somehow it just never quite feels the same as when you've leveled up yourself. And so I actually don't tend to do that very often when I'm playing. And I honestly, I don't even know if I can fully explain why that is. But there is something important about that process that kind of gets you to a state of a character. And well, no, I mean, there absolutely is an understanding of abilities, because once again, if even for me, right, if we create an ability and then I just try it at a high level without actually doing a playthrough that earned it, this is actually one of those things, by the way, that actually was okay. So the reason why the Huntress, I mean, this is true of any class we didn't add, but the reason why the Huntress wasn't ready is we had a bunch of abilities that were effectively designed without doing the playthroughs, right? Like we would make an ability, like this is before, right? We'd make an ability, we would put it in the game, we'd try it on a character that we had pre-constructed and be like, oh yeah, this ability, does this, right? But until we realized at some point that when you actually were playing and then you got the when you were actually playing and then had the ability to select it for yourself, it completely changed the vibe of how that skill felt like. It's important that you actually test the part where you're actually trying to weave it into a build that you've got going through. And so without that, you actually don't even have really an ability that you've actually tested and know that's good.
Now, to be fair, PoE 2 is a massive game, and not only does it have a large number of choices to make by default before you look at combinations and permutations, the amount of support gems that are in the game, skill gems that are in the game, the amount of choices you get with the weapons and the stats that scale those as well. But one piece of feedback that I've seen quite a lot, and let me know if this is something that you experience as well, is it doesn't feel like for most characters in most builds, at least in the current state, it doesn't feel like you could, put all of your class fantasy style abilities without multi-classing or multi-weaponing. Like you say you're a mercenary and you have a crossbow, and it's not like you can put all of your crossbow skills on a dartboard, throw a dart at it, and then pick up whichever skill you want and then complete the campaign with it or do some difficult content with it, because it does feel like some abilities are just inherently scaling way better than others, or just have a better balance from levels, the start of when that gem becomes available to how it progresses over time. Some abilities just feel like they're way better balanced and designed, and some feel less so. And I think that might be where we're at right now, is that in their rush to get the game out, at least in this early state so people can play it, there's definitely some skills and abilities that fell to the wayside. And it also brings more questions to how they're going to manage balance going forward. Because I think that some of the builds, not all, but some of the builds that came from season 1 ended up getting hit really hard going into season 2, to the point where people that really like those skills, like Spark, for example, are just ignoring it completely in season 2 because it got so gutted or didn't have the same feel to it. So I feel like, at least right now, The focus should be on content, getting the monster types into the game, more bosses, getting more activities for endgame, and also finishing the campaign, getting all the classes and weapons into the game as well. But there also needs to be a focus in making sure that we're bringing up the bottom line. So the things that, not only the things that are deleting Arbiter of Ash in under a second are being addressed, but also the things that even despite your best efforts, no matter what you do, never get used because they're just too dang weak, depending on how you build your character. So hopefully that ends up getting better as we move on, but at least we have some insight as to how that came about and where that's coming from, which is understandable. You know, the problem existing now is not really a super big admission of guilt or anything like that, but if the problem continues in this fashion without being addressed, that would be more of a major issue, right? Because we would want that in the 1.0 release, that there's a lot more breadth of choice with the skills that you can choose, and those skills actually being effective for most stages of the game, if not all stages of the game, assuming you're using them correctly. Next, let's talk about a comment that came up. This isn't a super extended topic, but there was a question that was brought up by JP saying, how do you feel about the Ascendancy Trials right now? I think the Ascendancy Trials, both Sekhmet and Chaos, have been a major point of conversation for most people playing Path of Exile 2. A lot of discussion has gone into the honor system in the Trial of Sekhmet, being able to take damage, some builds being better at avoiding damage than others, which is how the system benefits or, you know, makes those characters excel or fail. There's also a lot of feedback around the 3rd and 4th Ascendancy Trial, so either doing, you know, high floor count in Trial Chaos or the Trial Master versus even the 3rd or 4th boss setup for Trial of Sekhmet, especially the 4th Ascendancy for Sekhmet, if that's the route you go, ends up hurting really hard, and some builds struggle significantly with that as well. And there was a question of like, is this what you expect? So let's listen in on what the response to that question was.
Is that always going to be that process to where you,
how many runs,
have to build up to
how many runs did it take is the question I have for you.
4, with one of them being under leveled because I was just farming relics.
I would say 2 or 3 is more than what I would want for the 3rd Ascension. Well, to be honest, probably for the first few, like that sort of 2 or 3 kind of zone is kind of more what I would expect. Is right, but it obviously it sort of is dependent, right? Like a good player should be able to do it in one once they know how to, you know, once they know how to do that stuff. Or they, yeah, I mean, it just comes down to like individual cases and that sort of stuff. Like we just have to make sure that they're all good. And as I said, we've got so many monsters that it's like hard to even, you know, like it takes a long time to go through this stuff.
Which on average, I think is about right. You would probably expect a few attempts, especially in Trial Chaos, where, you know, everything is very random, right? The boss you get at the end of Trial Chaos or Ultimatum, the different debuffs you're forced to choose, as well as the layouts and Trials. There's a little bit less RNG in Sekhmet, but still some. You know, the kind of trials you get and the debuffs you get, the affixes or afflictions that you get in that as well. Though it's a little less random because of the final boss being kind of known. For the most part, you have the 4 bosses you reach in the 4 different trials for Sekhmet are very well known. The 3rd and 4th ones being very difficult, the Scorpion and then the Time Traveler at the very end. But in general, that kind of being a little bit more known. And I would expect probably 2 or 3 attempts for an RNG system. But I'm curious what your experience is. So if you guys want to drop down in the comments below, how many attempts per Ascendancy are you requiring? Like if you're doing, you know, on average, people do their first Ascendancy between level 22 and 30 in Act 2, between, you know, like 38 and 45 in Act 3. Then you have the 3rd Ascendancy and 4th Ascendancy, which you can choose either Chaos or Sekhmet. Generally mid-60s for the 3rd Ascendancy and mid-70s for the 4th Ascendancy, but it depends on your experience level and all of that. But are you guys getting what they expect? The 2 to 3 attempts per Ascendancy, you get it done and you move on and you're back to doing campaign or maps? So let me know what you think about that down below. The next topic is a very important one, and again is also hotly debated, and is the idea of the start of a league. How much time are you expected to have to invest in order to reach endgame? And Co-Carnage actually had a great question about this as well. He had put this very eloquently in that there are 2 different states of the game. There is the pre-end game, which is like the campaign getting caught up at the start of the league. And then there's the end game, which in a lot of cases do feel like 2 separate games. And there are different approaches to this. You know, Diablo 4 allows you to skip campaign entirely. You can do adventure mode. There's also lots of catch-up mechanics mechanics in games like Last Epoch, where after your first character, things get faster and faster. In general, I would say if you know what you're doing in Path of Exile 1, it usually takes you about 6 to 12 hours, you know, 6 being the record level and like 12 to 15 being more casual in that, to get to endgame and start working on your endgame build. Whereas it feels like right now, at least with the normal Act 1, 2, 3, cruel Act 1, 2, 3, it takes 20 to 30 plus hours to get to endgame before you start working on your endgame build. And this is a big debate for a lot of people. Some people, I think, felt the slog of the campaign because they were having to do it again after season 1. They have to start over completely with no gear, no currency items, and do the campaign again. And obviously is going to feel a lot slower, but also just the sheer time investment. I've heard of a lot of people that talk about season 2, Dawn of the Hunt, where they start a character and then they're like a week or 2 later and they're still not doing maps because of their time constraints or their schedule or what they have available. They just feel like they're not able to get to that end game portion of the game. So this is a really big topic that got discussed. So let's dive into what some of those responses were.
And this is the reason why I'm always hesitant. People are like, are you wanting to slow the game down? And then it's like, well, I mean, I want to be honest, this is not even as fast as it can go, right? Like, so, as I said,
Sounds like what people are saying is they want the game sped up at the beginning.
Sure, some people do say that, right? And that is, I think, a bit of a difference. That might be. Well, so this is an interesting concern, right? Because the other thing as well is even the term beginning means something entirely different to some players than others. Like like some people will tell me, oh yeah, like, you know, the monsters have too much life in the early game, and then I find out they're talking about like Act 5, you know, like effectively crawl Act 2, and it's kind of like from their perspective that's the beginning of the game, right? So it's like I think that we did have a problem with issues like in the sort of mid-campaign. The other thing as well that we have an issue with is right now we still have cruel difficulty, right? And so the game does drag in cruel difficulty if it's like, you know, a little bit when you've played this before. Like, you know, we had this back in PoE1 in the early days, but you know, the game does start to drag in the second time you're playing through the campaign. So
right.
Just not having that problem will be a massive boost as well, you know, once we get all the acts and everything like that. So
I think we need to pay really close attention to the experience of the campaign now, which is incomplete and also partially done, right? So there is some reliance on, like, it's doubled because we have normal Act 1, 2, and 3, then you do Act 1, 2, and 3 again on cruel difficulty. And honestly, at least in my experience, PoE 1, Acts 4, 5, and 6 tend to fly a little bit faster, and hopefully they end up taking that same approach with Act 4, 5, and 6 as cruel difficulty gets removed. But there is something to be said about the state right now. If people are, you know, taking 25 hours to finish the campaign because they have to do Act 1, 2, and 3 twice, that means that if Act 3 is too long, then you have to do it twice. That's doubling the impact that Act 3 has on the overall campaign. And so hopefully as we move into the future, that Act 4 and 5 and 6 feel like a good addition and don't add a crazy amount of time to that, because I think there probably is a safe range of amount of time required to complete the campaign, and also how many freaking times you have to do it. I'm not saying that they need to do campaign skip like Diablo 4, but I think that there is something to be said about people that don't play ARPGs every season simply because they don't like having to repeat the entire campaign all over again for the 40th time every time they start a new season, which I think ends up removing some of the players that normally would enjoy the build making process, completing difficult content and making their own builds, or, you know, using guides to experience the game, that don't have that. And a solution that actually came to mind while I was listening to this interview is the solution that Black Desert Online uses for their process. So if you make a brand new character, Black Desert Online is a Korean MMO. If you make a new character in Black Desert Online, rather than trying to improve the new player to like basically the campaign for getting your character into endgame, rather than trying to improve that, because they spent many years trying to make it better, they just made different campaigns. And so what happens when you're playing Black Desert Online is you will actually get a pop-up on screen, which looks like this, by the way, and it's something that they started doing maybe 4 years ago, and I actually think might solve some of this problem. If they are stuck on the track of, like, we want people to play through the campaign fully at the start of a season and then use the the gear that they get to make those subsequent playthroughs better. I actually think this is a very good solution that probably would fit well in this situation. So what you're seeing on screen is the character creation process in Black Desert Online. Ancient Stone Chamber is like the original campaign that they had, and with future updates, they added in alternate paths. So these other two, Land of Morning Light and Mountain of Eternal Winter, are their own like level 1 to end game campaign experiences that are about as long as this one, maybe even a little bit shorter. So if you just did a playthrough doing, you know, let's say maybe Act 1 and 2 and 3, that what we have right now is the current campaign to end game, it might be actually kind of cool to make alternate campaigns that are similar in length, and you would be able to pick and choose which one you do that season or which one you do that character, which does help make multiple playthroughs and multiple characters feel fresh and different, because you're doing the same process of getting from level 1 to level 70 in Path of Exile 2, but you're doing it with a different campaign setup and would give them more chance to have that campaign there. But there's definitely a concern that if they decide to do like a campaign with 6 acts in it, and you have to do it at the start of every season, and it takes 25 plus hours, that they're going to alienate some people that may not have that kind of investment before they actually get into endgame, and they may stop playing the game altogether. But let me know what your perspective is on that.
That's like, for a brand new player like me, the speed was fine at the beginning.
Right.
But like, I could totally see myself going through the same act again with a different character and going, wow, this feels like I'm trudging through a swamp.
I mean, have you guys thought about
That's-
changing that at all from
Yeah.
PoE1? Like, what's the thinking with that?
Changing
Well,
what exactly?
the biggest
For instance,
comment that we all
ahead.
get is like, do I still have to do the campaign? Like, just
Right,
to completely cut,
So-
like, do I still got to do the campaign? Like, is there going to ever
right,
be
right.
shortcuts, skips, alternate routes?
Like one
I'm-
big
I-
thing is respecting time. Like that's
Right, right.
that. Like a lot of people feel that in PoE2, it doesn't respect necessarily the time, especially compared to PoE1, because of how slower it is. So are we going to have like a cumulative effect of not only having this much larger, much girthier, slower campaign, but then also having to repeat that multiple times?
Well, okay, so I guess the part that I would say about that is that at the end of the day, and this is kind of the way that I tend to think about things, is like, if you're saying that you're not enjoying the campaign, then that just means the campaign needs to be better, right? Like, it's just like
Even if it's like the 15th
I
or
understand,
20th
like,
time
on
they
an
played it.
Well, I understand, but on an intellectual level, it's easy to say, okay, I'm not going to enjoy playing through this again. And that might even be true with the campaign in its current state, but I am a believer in the idea that you can make something like this compelling enough that it is fun to play again. And part of the reason why it is because when we have leagues, there's a different thing going on with the campaign to kind of mean that, you know, like it changes your perspective on, you know, like what things are. In an ideal league will actually affect the content that you're playing as well. Like, it'll make it feel like a different play experience. And then there's also the fact that you're playing a different character class. It has a different feel. Like, there are bosses where like they feel completely different. Like, there are a lot of the time there'll be situations where like, okay, you know, you'll play a boss with one type of character, then you'll play it with another one. It just feels like a completely different thing. Like, this boss, I just trivialized it. It was easy the first time I went through. This time I'm having, like, you know, it's like just due to the way that my character is, you know, feels very different. So I guess what I'm saying is that, like, it's certainly not helped by the fact that we've got 2 copies of the campaign in the game right now, because it meant that you played through it twice, you know, like the first time you played through it. Like, I believe that it is possible to get the campaign to the point where you will be fine playing through it. And it's like, ideally the experience you're having is just fun. And I mean, like, the PoE1 campaign, I mean, you know, like, it does get stale over time eventually, but like, it's still something that people play through again and again and again. And like, the reason why is it's there to host the other content that we also add every time, right? Like, it's there to be the place where you do all these things. And I don't know that if, like, okay, if you just started level 1 in endgame, like, I'm not really sure that would be like that different, really. Like, I mean, like, at the end of, okay, like, why are you playing a game again at all, right? There's like 3 reasons you could be doing it. One reason is to experience the new content that we've added. And because of the way we add content in leagues, like, you can experience that in the early game or the end game. So that doesn't kind of change anything about that. And another reason can be that you're playing a different character class, in which case you still need the experience of like leveling it up and going through and, like, you know, sort of learning the abilities and growing with you. So like, I don't know that like starting in the end game would materially change that, really. Like, it's just a question of like, are you having fun doing the thing you're doing?
Anything you do 20 plus times, like you're doing the same thing, hearing the same voice lines, doing the exact same pattern. Like, even if you're engaged, it still seems like it would just get super repetitive. PoE is 2 distinct different games. It is the campaign and it is the end game. And a lot of people don't want to play this first one a bunch of times, but they really want to play the second one a bunch of times, which means they have to slog through the first one a bunch of times to get to the part they like.
Here's where I think that I disagree about that, is that I don't see those as two separate things in the same way that I think that that you necessarily are saying there. Because ultimately, like, okay, like you said, anything that you play through 20 times can get boring, and I don't disagree with that. But then at the same time, in the end game, you're playing through the same map 20 times.
But you're coming
like,
back to the season for like the new mechanics, the new changes. So you come back for the new stuff, but you only get to that stuff
is also available in the campaign as well. So if you're going to make the argument that playing through the, like what I'm saying is like the only difference between the campaign and the end game is the order in which you play through areas is fixed in the campaign and isn't in the end game. The other difference being that you've got more of a mix of mechanics, where you've got like like different, like there's more overlapping mechanics that are happening at the same time. But I don't know that even in a context where you were like, if you imagine playing the end game from level 1, I don't think you could just introduce every single thing like right at the very beginning of that either, right? Like you have to have on some level.
But I mean, it seems like there would be some kind of middle ground for like you do the campaign once per patch or league, and then your second campaign is like shorter, or maybe you have all the exits already marked on your map before you get there.
Within a league, effectively.
Yeah, so within a league. So like every time you do a new character, like the campaign vicariously gets like shorter and shorter and shorter, not necessarily due to content, but the player's ability to get through it.
Well, one of the things as far as like multiple playthroughs of within a single league is that I think that players are maybe not happy enough with the level of like of like power leveling items that they're getting, because like the theory is that you play through the campaign once, you go to end game, you've got a bunch, like you get a bunch of items, and now your second playthrough is way easier because you've got a bunch of items that you got from before. And so I mean that should more than double the speed that you're going through the campaign, like very easily. But even just having currency in your stash, like, and just buying things on trade,
that's true.
As you level up is also going to get you a crazily different experience than what you'd have the first time through.
And I think that is kind of a good range of answers, right? I think, again, Ko did an excellent job kind of alliterating this issue that a lot of people have. Some people want to have no campaign. Some people want to have a short campaign. Some people don't mind a long campaign as long as it's good. And then there's other solutions, like I mentioned, where you could have multiple different campaigns that span the same level ranges that you can choose from to make your variety better. And obviously between the other competitors in the ARPG space of you being able to reset, there's even non-ARPG games that are seasonal that have different solutions to this as well. But I'm curious what your thoughts on this are. Are you someone who's in the camp of, I wish that we had a campaign skip, or I wish there were some speed up options after the first, like being able to reveal the map if it's your second time through the campaign within that single league, or being able to skip things, or is the amount of currency items and gear that you get through your first playthrough that you can then use on your second league character, is that enough, especially if you're on trade league, to expedite the campaign to your liking as we move into the future of the game and as we get Act 4, Act 5, Act 6, or if it's something that needs to be addressed moving forward. Like, do we actually need a shorter campaign, a faster campaign, a better campaign, or is it as is still fine? Let me know what your thoughts are on this, as well as the whole interview down below, and I'll leave a link to the full interview for Dropped Frames down below as well in the comments and in the description. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.